Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar sponsored by AABANY, the Asian American Bar Association of New York. My name is Karen King. I'm counsel at Paul Weiss. I'm also one of the vice chairs of AABANY's Pro Bono and Community Service Committee. Our topic today is anti-Asian violence and hate arising from the COVID-19 pandemic. And as many of you know, there has been just wonderful turnout for this event. We capped out the Zoom capacity right away and had to get some expanded capacity today, but luckily everyone on the waiting list was able to join us. This speaks, I think, largely to the importance and to the, just make sure that everyone's microphone is muted during the program, unless it's your turn to speak. If you have a question, please send it to the chat box and I will do my best to ask the question during the program. There is also a Q&A segment at the very end of the program, so we can also take some questions at that point. And without further delay, let's meet our panel today. We have put together a great combination of leaders and practitioners to share some of their experiences and thoughts with you. And we certainly want to have and encourage a very lively discussion. It would be most efficient, again, as I said, to send your questions through the Zoom chat, and I think all of our panelists will be able to answer questions at the end. So let me turn to each of the panelists and have them provide just a few words to introduce themselves and tell us about their work and their interest in the subject. I'd like to start with Jia Lynn Yang, if that's okay. Jia Lynn, can you undo your mute?
Hi, I'm a deputy national editor at the New York Times. So in that regard, I help oversee coverage of the country. I recently edited our front page story on Asian American hate crimes. And I have a new book coming out in a few weeks called One Mighty and Irresistible Tide on the history of the 1965 Immigration and Nationality Act. Which is the law, I'm sure all of you are lawyers, so you know, that allowed many Asian Americans to settle in this country, including my own.
Wonderful. Thanks, Jia Lynn, for being with us. Next, I'll turn to Joann Yu, the Executive Director of the Asian American Federation. Joann, can you say a few words? Oh, undo your mic.
Hi, everyone. Just jumping off a Zoom over. City Council is doing hearings, budget hearings, and so it was interesting to do a Zoom City Council hearing, and I didn't get to finish, but I'm really thrilled to be here, and thank you for inviting me. I am Joann Yu, Executive Director of the Asian American Federation. I see my board member, Chris Kwok, on this call, and I see my old buddy, John Yang, which means that, you know, we're gonna have to totally bring it today, guys. We are a leadership convener of 70 nonprofit organizations that is led by and serves the Asian American community in the area of health and human services, community development, and civil rights. And we are the research, policy, and advocacy leadership group for the Asian American community in New York City. And like John's group, we are a census information center. So things have been pretty busy for us before all of this started. So I'm happy to be here.
Thanks, Joann. Next, let me turn to John Yang, who is the Executive Director of the Asian Americans Advancing Justice. John, can you introduce yourself?
Great, thank you very much. I'm John Yang. I'm the President and Executive Director of Asian Americans Advancing Justice, AAJC. We're part of a national network of 5 independent affiliates that are located in Atlanta, Chicago, Los Angeles, and San Francisco. So I'm based in DC. Our mission is to advance the civil and human rights of Asian Americans and to promote a fair and equitable society for all. So we also have community partners throughout the country and privileged to work with people like Joann on the ground in New York. Certainly what she says is absolutely true. In this particular time, we've been doing a lot of work around COVID-19, especially the anti-Asian racism that all of us have seen. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. And I also appreciate the plug by Joann on census. Hopefully everyone has filled it out. If not, please go online or call in your responses, because that's also very important to our Asian American community. Thank you very much.
Thanks, John. Next, Sheryl Koretz, who is a real estate associate at Simpson, Thatcher, and Bartlett. Simpson Thatcher has been working with AABANY to help produce a number of brochures on Know Your Rights regarding various topics, including this one, the anti-Asian violence topic. Sheryl, do you want to say a few words?
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Sheryl Koretz. As Karen mentioned, I'm with Simpson, Thatcher, and Bartlett, and we are working with AABANY on a series of resource documents and some other potential projects. And I wanted to get involved in this because I think it's important to advocate for victims, especially in underrepresented communities. I volunteered as a victim witness advocate in the past and know how important it is for victims to be heard and to have a platform to tell stories. So I'm really glad to be a part of this initiative.
Fabulous. Thanks, Sheryl. And last but not least, Joe Gim, who is the Deputy Chief of the County Court Trial Bureau at Nassau County District Attorney's Office. Joe, can you say a few words?
Thanks, Karen. Thanks for having me. I'm hoping this will be helpful. I'm a co-chair in the Prosecutors Committee along with David Chang, who's also on the call in Queens, and also ADA Maria Park, who is in the Brooklyn DA's office. There are a number of prosecutors on this call, so I'm hoping I can provide some people with insight on the criminal statutes.
Great. Thank you to all 5 panelists for being here today. Let's kick it off. Joann, if I could turn to you to start and provide a little background on what you and your organization are seeing on the ground. What is happening in the communities here in New York as it relates to this anti-Asian violence and hate? What are you seeing? Oh, microphone.
So thank you. I want to give a little context to our community. I think oftentimes when we share statistics, people are always surprised by what the numbers bear out. So I'm going to lay out a little context. The Asian American community, as all of you know, it's the fastest growing population, and not just the New York City and state, but the country. And Asia in New York City, Asians make up 60% of the population. And I think as much as we think Asian Americans live in a few enclaves, that is certainly not true. And we are defining New York City neighborhoods because we represent 12% or more of the residents in at least 26 of the 51 council districts. We are, but besides the population, I think the poverty level in our community is very real. I know that we are truly stymied by the model minority myth, but and that is, does a lot of disservice to our community. Approximately 1 in 4 Asian New Yorkers live in poverty. It's the highest of all the major racial groups in our city. We just looked at some statistics this morning about who is dying in the front lines of this pandemic, and it's the Bangladeshi community, who happens to be the poorest community. And I also want to say that I just want to share with you that nearly half the Asian American New Yorkers have limited English proficiency. 1 in 4 Asian Americans aged 25 and older never completed high school. And additionally, many are not literate in their own language. So, we give out all these fancy flyers and do all these cool designs and translate it into gazillion languages, but oftentimes the people we distribute to can't even read it in their own language. So that's something that we think about. 70% of immigration is a key issue in our community. It is a driving factor behind the population growth. About 70% of Asian Americans are foreign-born, and 90% of the city's Asian children have at least one immigrant parent. Immigration also is a pressing issue in our community, as Chinese, Indian, and Bangladeshi immigrants make up 40% of those in deportation in New York City. The reason why the numbers are so high, it's because there is very few affordable resources existing to help Asian immigrants. And I will also say that, John and I have worked many years together to figure out what the federal immigration policy landscape has been. And we've worked on a lot of the public charge cases, because I think that is the biggest obstacle to, especially now when low income and undocumented immigrants need to be able to get in front of some public benefits to be able to live. And all of those, the legs of those programs are completely cut. So I know that we have made many trips to DC, and John and I are sitting in all the same circles, screaming the exact same thing. And so, you know, it's always good to see an ally here. So starting January for us as a leadership organization, you know, I think everybody recognizes what's been happening since March, but I'd like to remind people that groups like the Asian American Federation, our member agencies, have been talking to any media outlet who will listen to us to tell people exactly what is happening. Starting January, before Lunar New Year, we were talking about, you know, we had a pretty aggressive media strategy to talk about the small business, the challenges that small businesses were seeing. There were people, before Lunar New Year, people were closing, and the restaurants were saying, we see 90% business decline. And so, you know, this was a very big reality for us. So I will say that I think recently my staff members, you know, pulled together a list of all the media outlets I've been talking to. It's New York, you know, New York One, WNYC, Wall Street Journal, you know, anybody who will listen, because I think the reality is that our community continues to be invisible and marginalized. And, you know, I get to yell at, with my leadership, I get to yell at a lot of different people. And I've been telling government that it is certainly proven to me through this crisis that we are definitely not even second-class citizens, but Asians are certainly third-class citizens.
Joanne, when did you see a rise in the sort of violence or hate crime or even bias incidents in New York?
We saw it from the get-go. We saw it from the jump. We saw from, you know, the minute it was announced and they said it was in China, right? Like then, and then the Asian American community, we are used to, I had to go on media to tell people why Asian American wearing masks for the Asian American community was not a thing, is a new thing, or it wasn't anything weird, because that's how we all grew up in Asia. And you know, the minute people put on masks to ride the subways and get on the buses, people were getting attacked and people were saying horrible things. So I think very early on, I'm going to say like January, we started to see the numbers creep up, weird incidents. I mean, the story that I tell is, you know, I was on the Brian Lehrer show talking about, you know, telling people, don't be racist. This is not, you know, Asians can't get it just because of our DNA. This is really a pandemic. You know, this is, by then it wasn't a pandemic. And after the radio show, I'm getting on the subway to go to my office. And then sure enough, there's a lady sitting next to me in this empty section of the train, looks over at me, and then realizes that I'm Asian and goes to sit on the other side where she didn't even get a seat. It was packed. And so, you know, I laughed about it, but I think this is a very real thing that we have all experienced. Our work really has been to demand some assistance from NYPD and all the law enforcement. I don't have a relationship with NYPD. I do have a relationship, but I have friends in the FBI built through years of, you know, just working together and just, you know, being loud and calling things out. And they've been great. They've been really great to outreach. We had a relationship with NYPD when the previous commissioner, we have yet to meet Commissioner Shea. So we've been saying, you know, what protections are in place to help our communities understand what their rights are. And, you know, now those calls are taking place. So we're really excited. We are currently working with the FBI.
If I could jump in there, I mean, I'd love to hear from the prosecutor, Joe, your perspective on some of this reach out that Joanne's talking about, and also if you could help, since we have a lot of lawyers on this call, help us understand what exactly is a hate crime under the New York statutes, and how does that process play out when someone actually does report. Oh, microphone.
Sorry, I got it. So I just wanted to thank Joanne, first of all, for being one of the first and the loudest voices in the room to talk about this issue and other issues that the Asian American community, as diverse as it is, experiences. You know, we here in AABANY, we're kind of an echo chamber. Everyone in this room should be a lawyer, so we represent a certain sub-slice of what being an Asian American is. In some ways, this whole situation has brought us more in line with what the general community is experiencing, because we're experiencing certain things ourselves, a certain fear that normally we wouldn't really have to experience on a day-to-day basis. So what I want to do right now is just bring in a little bit of perspective in terms of talking about the idea of what is a crime, what is not a crime. You hear hate crime, you hear bias incidents, bias crimes. It's really important that we as lawyers are able to sort of parse these issues intellectually, and then we can have a better discussion about where the weak links are, where maybe we can influence or change certain things associated with them. So in the handouts, there was a large section in the beginning. There's a number of hate crime statutes that were communicated. There's a slide, it looks like, talking about hate crimes, and this is going to be penal law. There's a whole section. Penal law 485 is from the hate crime bill of 2000. This is usually what people talk about when they talk about hate crimes. And when I say people, I mean NYPD, I mean everyone. I'm pretty sure Jia Lynn, this is pretty much what gets quoted to you in terms of what qualifies as a crime and not a crime. And the statute reads, you guys all have it in front of you, but I'll just blow through it real quick. When a person intentionally selects the person against whom the offense is committed or intended to be committed in whole or in substantial part because of a belief or perception regarding the race, color, national origin, all this other stuff. So, you know, all of your categories fit in after that fact, okay? Now, what Penal Law 48505 does is it elevates the amount of punishment that a person would receive for a crime that already exists on the books. So, among the hate crime or bias incidents that we're talking about, you're talking about a very small subset of cases that would fit under this specific penal law. And I'll explain that a little bit in a second. So the second statute I want you guys to start thinking about and talking about, especially if we're going to start doing community outreach, and especially if we're going to be helping people interact with the police department, that's aggravated harassment in the second degree. And that's under Penal Law 240, sub 30, subdivision 3. Now, all of those things are necessary. And the reason why it's necessary is aggravated harassment in the second degree is a statute that is regularly charged, only it's under the other subs. So it's under the subs that have to do with harassing someone over the phone or over mail. So this comes up a lot in the context of domestic violence cases or ex-boyfriend, girlfriend cases. But there's this specific sub, and I'm gonna read the elements to you, that deals with incidents having to do with bias crimes. Okay, so with the intent to harass, annoy, threaten, or alarm another person, he or she strikes, shoves, kicks, or otherwise subjects another person to physical contact or attempts or threatens to do the same because of a belief or perception regarding such person's race, color, national origin, ancestry, gender identity, et cetera, et cetera. So why is this important? Well, number one, the hate crime bill that everyone talks about, 48505, does not include this statute. This statute is not included there. Generally speaking, it's not discussed. And this is actually a situation where a person can be arrested for a crime simply for their words and their intent with relationship to their words. So it actually doesn't have to do with actually committing a physical violent act. So the mere threat of a physically violent act coupled with some evidence that it was because of a belief or perception regarding the person's race, color, national identity, et cetera, those are the two things where, you know, when you fit within those elements, you can have someone arrested for a crime just based on words. So normally when you're interacting with the police, and this is true most of the time, the police are going to want to know, like, did you suffer an injury and was there physical contact? Because under normal circumstances, those are the two cutoff points with regards to violence. If you haven't been injured, and if it was just words, usually that won't rise to the level of a crime where an arrest can be made. So police are used to telling people, well, I can't arrest based on words alone. But this statute is a misdemeanor, in which case they can arrest. In fact, they're supposed to arrest based on this type of allegation. And I think most people don't know that. I think even people within the community, I think even people fighting for Asian Americans, advocating for Asian Americans, don't know about this specific statute because they're focusing on the other one, which really only applies to situations where someone's already been hurt, or something's been stolen, or someone's been attacked with a weapon. So this is a situation where, just going to a hypothetical, you're walking down the street and a person threatens violence towards you, and it's clear from their words or actions that it is based upon a belief related to your national origin or race, whether it's true or not, as long as you can show that they believed it at the time, then that actually would be a crime. So I think it's really important that for those of you who have not seen the statute before, that you look at it, you become familiar with it, because it has a really wide-ranging sort of applicability. It's got fairly low levels of standard in terms of the conduct that you would have to reach, but it's extremely specific on the words that are coming out of the person's mouth, right? So we need to be able, with some level of precision, recite what it was that this person had said. So it's not enough for you or anyone to look at the incident and say, oh, that must have been because of, or why else would that person walk up to a stranger? There has to be more than that. And that may help, right? We may be aided by the specific time or the specific news cycle, or be able to pick up on certain things depending on when it is that this incident occurred, right? Did this occur in February? Did this occur in early March, late March? That's one of the factors, but it's really going to be important for us to identify within the words something that would clarify that they were doing this specifically because of their belief on your race, number one, and number two, that the words were a threat or were an attempt to strike, shove, initiate some kind of physical conduct, including that physical contact can include spitting, right? So if they spit and they miss you, that would fit within the statute. And the last portion that we have to identify from the words is that they did so with the intent to harass, annoy, threaten, or alarm you, which, as you can understand, is a pretty low standard, but we have to know exactly what it was that was said, especially since Joanne pointed out, a lot of the victims of these crimes are going to be people where English isn't their first language. So to the extent that we can nail that down, to the extent that we can get some type of video, to the extent that we can really focus in on the specifics of that incident and recreate that incident later in time to be as identical to the original incident as possible, obviously video helps, then we can pursue a prosecution in that case.
So let me jump in there. I know, John Yang, that there has been a lot of reporting to organizations like your own because people are reluctant to actually go to the police. So what types of things are people reporting to you? And so we can have a better sense of, how many would meet the standard and what people's real life experiences have been.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for that question. And I think that's right. It's actually a lot more incidents that we're seeing would fall into that broader category that Joe is talking about. But certainly the vast majority of them, probably in about the two-thirds range, maybe 60 to two-thirds range, involve some type of verbal harassment, right? Names saying, you Chinese brought the coronavirus, you go back to China with the virus with you, things along those lines. I mean, that is a very frequent type of verbal harassment that we're seeing. Certainly one step removed from that would be spitting. And it's, whether we've seen it at supermarkets, we've seen it in businesses, or we've seen it in streets again, right? Then sort of, again, one step removed from that, we don't see this as often anymore because of distance learning, so to speak, but we saw quite a few incidences early on of bullying. And this, frankly, to me is tragic, because that's where you're dealing with, oftentimes this is at the teenage level, although we've seen elementary school as well. Kids getting pushed up against lockers, kids having books slapped out of their hands. And again, those same types of verbal words being used while that's been happening. Just to give some quantity on it, is between two organizations in California, as well as our organization in DC, there's also OCA, all of us are working together on it. If you combine all the data, and this is, again, just self-reports, voluntary reports, we're talking about 1,700 over the last 5-week period. And one thing to emphasize is this is not just Chinese Americans, right? Like within this audience, I could say it, Caucasians can't tell the difference between all of us. And so if you look at that data, it really does involve the full gambit of not just East Asian Americans, though, all Asian Americans. You could say that maybe the incidences involving South Asian Americans are going to be a little bit lower compared to population, but certainly the number of Vietnamese Americans, Laotian Americans, Hmong Americans, the people that were stabbed in Texas were Southeast Asians. They were not Chinese Americans, right? And so it's hitting our entire community. The other thing I would note, and certainly I'd be happy to engage in questions and answers and talk about this, is with respect to New York, one of the things that we're seeing, certainly California, both our statistics as well as the California statistics, California has quote unquote led the way in terms of incidents. New York, though, comes second. New York, for our reporting site, is about 15%. I think the California reporting sites, it's about 16%. So certainly the number of incidents in New York has been significant. And the other unfortunate thing, the other thing that is very troubling about all of this is that Asian American females are much more likely to be targeted than males. This is true on both reporting sites that we've seen. The California one is reporting it at about a 2.5% or 2.5 times.
And let me now turn to Jia Lynn to tell us a little bit about what you're seeing as a journalist. And I know you've done a lot of work looking at trends from historical periods, which also showed a lot of bias against Asian Americans. What have you been reporting on these days?
So I'm an editor and had the idea to do this story from a conversation with my mom, actually. And she herself has not faced any harassment, but was sort of voicing the fear of what will happen when she does leave her home and travels overseas, even, because this is a global phenomenon, obviously. And so we started reporting on a piece over a month ago now. And Serena Tavernisi, who I edit, spent a number of days reporting around the clock, and unfortunately did not have trouble finding pretty terrible stories pretty quickly. A lot of what John is describing, so people being spat on in public, incidents of bullying against children as young as 6 or 7, being called a Chinese virus. And there are people, there are groups, as I think some of us know, tracking the number of incidents, and yes, it's far surpassed 1,000. What was interesting after the piece came out is that a lot of people, I think, who felt really embarrassed and ashamed of what had happened to them and felt like they didn't want to talk about it, actually started coming forward and saying, this too has happened to me. So I do think that a lot of this is about letting people know that if they're scared or if this has happened, they're really not alone. And I think when that becomes clear, people are more willing to talk about it. But we're trying to think of other stories to do. This is not going to end, and I fear it will get worse. And people, even in our own community at the New York Times of Asian American people, have been talking about this decision: do you wear a mask? Do you not? What is safe or what's not? And even this question of what to do if something happens. Do you verbally respond, or might that provoke violence? People are sitting at home wondering, like, if and when this happens to me on the New York subway or walking down the street or at the grocery store, what am I supposed to do? It feels awful to just sit there silently to take it, but also it would be scary to speak up too. And then I would just say, I've been working on this book for a number of years now about the 1965 Immigration and Nationality Act, and through that did a lot of research, historic research, into just sort of the history of, I'd say, sort of the political standing of Asian Americans vis-a-vis America's immigration laws. And certainly there's a long history of anti-Asian violence. You think back to the yellow peril fears, the 1800s, which helped lead to the Chinese Exclusion Act. Then you get Japanese and Korean immigrants coming. They too face a backlash. Then immigration laws banned basically all Asians in 1924. What struck me, and I think is sort of worth keeping in our minds, is not only is there a history of anti-Asian violence and lawmaking, but if you look at the history of the 1965 law, which you could argue is single-handedly why there are so many Asian Americans in the country, given the family reunification priority, right? If you're here, you have priority for permanent residency if you've got family already in the U.S. What's interesting to me about that law is that if you look at the history, it was not really an explicit effort to allow so many Asian Americans into the country. In fact, it's a law that's reacting to a perceived discrimination against Jewish Americans, Italian Americans, people from Southern and Eastern Europe. And so they're trying to abolish quotas from the 20s that really not only blocked Asian Americans, but blocked Asian immigrants, but blocked Jews and Italians. And the idea of America as a nation of immigrants, people, for most of our country's history, when they think of immigrants, they think of Europe. They don't think of Asia or the Middle East or Africa or Latin America. And so when the 1965 law is passed, it does open up this window legally for all this non-white immigration to come. But if you look at the political origins of it and the fight over it, it's not explicitly a fight about Asian immigration. It's about European immigration. And the people who fight for it don't realize that the future of American immigration is going to get a whole lot less European. And so that's sort of the story I tell in my book. I think for right now, I find that really relevant because it tells me that this sort of political project of establishing Asian Americans as fully American, as for Asian immigrants to be fully American, is one that we kind of backed into as a country, you might say. Like there wasn't like a full-throated, we are going to be this multiracial immigration community. It was not, the law allowed for that to happen, but in this country, we never kind of explicitly said, this is what we want to have happen. And so when you look at someone like Stephen Miller, in the White House, I'd argue that he really knows this history quite well. He knows it in the past. We have turned the dial to more white immigration demographic profile, and we turned the dial towards something very different in 1965. And he, of course, is interested in going back to something more like the 20s. But I just think, this is a little bit abstract, but I just think when we think about the political standing of Asian Americans, it's really important to know the history and that we have kind of a tenuous, I would argue kind of a tenuous political position in this country because our immigration laws have allowed so many of our families to be here, but that sort of grand project of saying we are part of this country, I'd argue is quite incomplete and is very much an ongoing work in progress.
I'm curious if there's anything unique to what's happening in New York communities or the reporting that's happening in New York. I don't know if you or John have seen any sort of differential. I know the numbers are who's reporting, but is there more reluctance to report in New York? Is the word not out as far in New York? Is that perhaps a reason why the numbers are not higher in New York reporting these incidents? Or is New York different because New York is very, immigrant heavy and, more progressive in some ways? I'm just curious if you have any observations about New York specifically.
This is John. I mean, it's hard to say, but I think one thing that complicates at least our work is that the fact that the New York AG has been taken the initiative to have their own hotline. On one hand, is certainly very, very positive. We encourage state, local governments to have an active hand in this. But sort of we haven't had access to that data, right? And so if people are reporting there, they probably are not reporting to a separate line, right? So that might explain so-called lower numbers as far as our reporting sites would go. But it's hard to tell. I think the other thing, you're right, is just overall reluctance to report. has always been an issue for our community. I think most immigrant communities generally, and trying to help people tell their stories. And I very much appreciate what Jia Lynn said, and appreciate the New York Times reporting on that. I actually had the fortune of talking to Sabrina, and Matt Stevens from the New York Times has also worked a little bit on the Asian American identity issues. And certainly our report spiked after the New York Times article came out. And that it goes to her notion that there's a certain affirmation. People said, it's okay to tell my story. And that in itself, at least for our organization, we feel is therapeutic. I mean, it helps, right? That person to feel like, okay, there is a voice. I can talk about this. It's okay. So I got a little bit away from your original question, but certainly I think it's very complicated in terms of the reporting. And for us, part of it is not just the numbers themselves, but also the story and sort of what we're trying to help, how we're trying to help the community by doing what we're doing.
I agree, John. I think the challenge is the fact that, the immigrant numbers are so high. And, when we do the census, one of the things we realize is that, I think our statistics say more than half of the folks who are filling out the census of the Asian American community didn't do the census the last time, which means that they're new to this country. And they come from countries where police interaction has been horrible, right? Like the brutality, and they don't have a relationship where they see police as being somebody who can help. And I think it's the fact that NYPD, law enforcement, we've seen all the cases, what have playing out in other communities of color, and they don't have an interaction with us. The first thing I yell at NYPD is like, are you ever going to tell the community what the difference between hate crimes and bias incidents, and what are you going to have people report to you? I think that is a big factor because we don't have that interaction. And it's just the community itself. There was for this, us New Yorkers, we saw the video of the woman in Brooklyn who was a victim of the acid attack, somebody who threw acid at her, right? And she has yet to file a report. I know City Hall's been really desperate to reach out to her to see if they can help her. NYPD has been trying to reach out to get her to file something. And that case came to us through a friend through a staff member who goes to a church. And we've been trying to talk to her to say, part of you doing this is having to tell NYPD what is happening. They need to be able to hold people who are doing these horrific things, holding them responsible. And she just will not talk to the police. And so, I think it's a lot of different factors, but certainly it is our community's lack of interaction with law enforcement that's really prevented help from coming to our communities.
Great. I mean, as a legal organization and with so many lawyers on the line, I think people are probably very interested in what can we tell people if we are trying to help and doing what we can to interact with the community and explain to people what their rights are. Sheryl, would you mind commenting a bit on some of the sort of baseline information, know your rights points that lawyers can help articulate to the community?
Sure. So I think a lot of this has been mentioned before, but as far as reporting goes, it's important to report for multiple reasons. I think reporting to law enforcement helps identify and prosecute criminals who commit hate crimes and can also prevent future crimes. It can help victims be able to get compensation and other services if they have been a victim of a hate crime. It's also helpful in bringing civil claims against those responsible for the anti-Asian harassment and violence. And again, we can help recover damages for victims, and also bring about changes in policies and practices. So reporting to NGOs also helps collect this kind of information that helps further understand the scopes of the problem, obtain the resources and services necessary to address the problem, and to further affect policy changes as well. And so in New York, in order to report a hate crime to the police, we urge you to have your clients call 911 if they're experiencing a crime or any other emergency. After the fact, there are lots of organizations and agencies where people should report. In New York State and the city of New York, there are hate crimes task forces. So the New York State Hate Crimes Task Force is a division of the Human Rights Bias Incident Hotline. So you can have your clients report an incident online or by calling the hotline or by texting hate to 81336. And this information is all in the Know Your Rights document that is part of the materials as well. So some additional information about the State Hate Crimes Task Force is that victims may be able to apply for compensation and other assistance. You can help, the Office of Victims Services can help you find service providers. And it's important to note that clients don't necessarily need to have a physical injury in order to seek compensation for certain offenses. And there's also a hate crimes resource guide available from the New York Hate Crimes Task Force, and that's on their website. In New York City, there's an Office for the Prevention of Hate Crimes, which is part of the Hate Crimes Task Force of the city. You can contact them. They have a hotline and as well as a website. So we would encourage you to have clients report to this agency as well. There's also specific hotline for issues that have happened on MTA. So on the MTA bus, the subway, railroad, New York City has a specific hotline for those incidences, which I think is important. They also have a specific hotline related to any tips that you may have. So if you witness something, if your clients have heard something word of mouth, it's a good hotline to use for providing tips in order to help prosecute these incidences. So there also is a, the applicable precinct is who will handle these affairs. So, and also the New York Police Department Hate Crimes Task Force. You should also note when talking to your clients that immigration status does not prevent victims from reporting hate crimes and receiving these services in New York City. And the New York City government site also has a place where you can file a report online, and that's available in the document as well. Both New York State and New York City have human rights agencies as well, where you can file a complaint both on their website and through a hotline. So there's the New York State Division of Human Rights, as well as the New York City Commission on Human Rights, which are also both taking reports and tracking these types of incidences.
Great.
Your clients should also speak to their district attorney if they were filed a police report or are seeking to file a police report. All of the Manhattan, Brooklyn, Bronx, and Queens boroughs have hate crimes bureaus or units where you can specifically discuss incidences with the DA. Staten Island, you can call the DA as well, but that's another resource for your clients. And again, as mentioned before, the New York Attorney General's Office has its own Civil Rights Bureau, which has a hotline and an email where you can also email incidences. And then, as touched on earlier, the NGOs are really critical in tracking reports and coming up with solutions to problems. So, as mentioned, the Asian Pacific Policy and Planning Council encourages reporting, and they're tracking with an incident report that's available online in multiple languages. NAPABA has a bunch of resources available online. Communities Against Hate is also taking online reporting of incidents and tracking. And the reporting is encouraged and accessible at that website in Chinese, Korean, and Vietnamese. Assistance with legal and social services is also available through Communities Against Hate, and they have a Stop Hate hotline, which is accessible in a number of languages. And then they also have some additional resources specific to the coronavirus and COVID-19. And then finally, you can always go to the New York Civil Liberties Union, the Southern Poverty Law Center, and the ADL, the Anti-Defamation League, who also track reporting on these types of incidences.
And as Sheryl mentioned, there is a Know Your Rights document that's in the package of materials that you received in connection with this webinar. That document has been translated by AABANY and is available in multiple languages. There will be a community outreach to try to share some of that information, although as Joanne pointed out, it is hard sometimes with some of these communities where language and even literacy is a barrier. I know it can probably be overwhelming, all the different places that you can go to, both in the government and also the non-government organizations to report. I can anticipate that one of the questions clients might have about reporting to a government agency, at least, is what can they expect? Like, how much time will this mean to their lives? Will they have to deal with the police for an extended period of time if they want to try to report the crime and help with the prosecution? Joe, I know you touched a bit about the types of information that would be helpful if you actually wanted to have the crime prosecuted, recorded by the police and sent to the prosecutors. But in terms of the realistic experience of a victim, you know, what can they expect if they go down this path, and how can we communicate that to clients who might ask that question?
Thanks, Karen. This is an important subject. Our discovery statutes have recently been, as part of the bail reform, were changed. So our timetable for turning over information and the types of information that we turn over have been expanded greatly. So unfortunately, it's mostly bad news on this front. We are obligated to turn over your name and some reasonable means to contact you, which could be a phone number, it could be an email address. We certainly would talk to you before that happens, but we have to do so on a pretty accelerated timetable. It used to be 15 days, but it's expanded a bit from there. All timetables are frozen now because of COVID. And there was a recent budget reform that changed that timetable, I think, to 25, possibly 35 days moving forward. But yeah, people's information to that extent, and, you know, copies of the paperwork containing their version of what happened, their 911 calls, other forms of recording, either written or otherwise, of their statement, has to be turned over to the defendant. And it's a big problem. We've been, you know, disclosing that. I mean, this rule came into effect this year. We've been letting our witnesses know that. You know, it's pretty onerous, especially when you consider that we're having a tough time getting people to report to begin with. So this is a conversation that we're having with witnesses. They do need to know that you know, certain aspects of their identity are likely to be exposed. I do want to tell everyone that the actual incidents of follow-up on something like this, like, we'll get an order of protection. So instances where people, strangers with order of protections, actually get hunted down and intimidated are extremely few, very, very rare. It just does, for the most part, it doesn't happen. I can tell you that just from a macro perspective. But nonetheless, you know, that is something that's going to happen. As far as other information that's going to get turned over, any other witnesses that decide to report their information, which we need, their information also is going to be reported. So this is definitely something that, you know, does create issues. So I did want to talk a little bit about the discovery process, since the people in here are potentially going to be helping folks who are dealing with bias incidents and exploring possibly whether or not they're crimes and whether or not they should report them. So one thing that was brought up in the chats, we've had some pretty active members. Youngjin Choi has been shooting out quite a few questions. And one of the things that came up was that we should, you know, whether or not the police department is going to be asking about a person's immigration status. And I can say in the New York City Police Department that most certainly won't be happening. I think they have some pretty strong rules about when that happens and doesn't happen. So that doesn't happen in New York City. I believe that's actually by virtue of a city council decision. Outside of New York City, I can't guarantee that's not going to happen. So Nassau, Suffolk, someplace like that, I can't guarantee anything with regards to that. But, you know, by and large, my experience has been that the police department doesn't threaten victims or witnesses and could potentially get them in big trouble. So I imagine that won't be happening. The second thing I wanted to bring up was, and this is something that's been raised, there's something called a U visa. I don't know if people are familiar with that. That is a visa program that is extended to victims of crimes. I don't know that these crimes necessarily would qualify under the exceptions related to U visa, possibly assisting others who were, you know, it depends on whether or not, you know, there was some sort of actual physical violence. So the statute I was talking about, I don't know that that would necessarily fit within its very technical clause. And also, I do want to point out that, you know, in terms of how that plays out, it's not like you can ask your prosecutor or the police officer, hey, this happened to me and I reported it. Now am I going to get preferential treatment with my green card? I would highly recommend, first of all, they're not going to be able to tell you. Second of all, they're going to have to write that down, and that's going to be in the police report, and that's going to be the first thing we're going to have to tell defense counsel when we're talking about the case is, hey, this guy wanted to know about his, getting a green card. So I just want to caution folks with that, but people that are in the immigration practice, maybe this is something when we open it up to everyone, they could speak more specifically on whether that applies or not.
If I can add, I really appreciate Cheryl's comment about working with nonprofit organizations. Since we lead the Asian nonprofit organizations, I think this is a good plug for us. But you know, on many of the calls we've had with law enforcement, they've talked about, you know, the hate crimes task force. The commander comes on and, you know, reminds me a gazillion times, you know, that there's only been 11 hate crimes reported in New York, right? And you know, I always laugh at him and say, you know, I know 11 hate crimes myself. People just don't report to you, right? And so even on the calls, the commander has said, you know, we only have 11 hate crimes reported through NYPD. Meanwhile, my member agencies are emailing with the list of all the things that their community has talked about. They won't go to the NYPD, but they will go to the nonprofits. And I think one of the ways for the Bar Association to really, you know, offer their services is to go work with the system that exists. And that system is the nonprofit organizations. People, you know, these nonprofit organizations have anchored our communities for decades. And so, you know, they tell these nonprofits everything. I mean, these nonprofit organizations that serve all five, you know, in every corner of New York City, we call them the social firehouses, right? Anything ever happens, everybody runs and says, oh my gosh, you have to help me. So they hear every story. And, you know, I think, you know, one nonprofit might consider themselves, oh, you know, maybe I only do housing, right? But they hear everything. People will confess everything to them. So I know that a lot of the nonprofit organizations keep a list of all the things that they're hearing from their clients. And so, you know, I think part of this work is certainly reinventing the wheel, not to reinvent the wheel, but really work with the existing expertise on the ground. And I think, you know, yes, it's a lot of work for the nonprofit, for the Bar Association to all of a sudden go out and say, like, you know, who wants to file this? You know, like, we're willing to help. People still might not be willing, to be honest, right? But I think the natural partner is the nonprofit organizations. You know, they would love some help. We've been looking for some help from the legal community forever, everything from immigration to this. And so, you know, this is a perfect opportunity for the attorneys to be able to get to know the nonprofits, just, you know, beyond going to a gala, but really, you know, understanding the issues that all the vulnerable New Yorkers are facing, and then really digging, you know, helping to dig our heels in to be able to help our folks, you know, who are experiencing tremendous stress at this time.
Thanks, Joanne. Is there anything that a bystander can do to also help with reporting and help, you know, make these stories stronger or help build a case? I know, John, you've done a little bit of thinking on that. Do you want to share a little bit?
Sure. You bring up an excellent topic just generally, which is that of bystanders. Because I think Jia Lynn had mentioned also the question of, well, what do you do if you are faced with one of these situations, either as a witness or as the potential victim itself, or herself or himself? one of the things that our organization, along with the New York organization called Hollaback, has started doing is providing bystander intervention training. So this gives people the tools. Now, I want to emphasize up front, we don't want people to be superheroes. We don't want people to be vigilantes or play law enforcement. We're trying to give people the tools to de-escalate situations and really protect those victims, right? There's small things that people can do, whether it's just standing next to the victim and say, hey, are you okay? Starting a conversation with the victim to distract from whatever the perpetrator, whatever the aggressor is doing, right? If you're in a situation that you could call out, sort of call over law enforcement, call over some other authority figure to help in the situation, to document the situation, that can be helpful too, right? Or getting that victim to safety. All of these little, quote unquote, little steps really can help that victim feel just that much more protected, minimize the mental trauma, the psychological trauma that they're feeling, and be in a position to help. So that's something that we've started offering. I know Joann, I think, is working with us as well and Hollaback to provide even more localized New York training. So I think that is excellent as well. But you also bring up a good point in terms of what can bystanders do. Certainly, if a bystander sees one of these incidents, they should report them to certainly whether it's our website, APCON's website, and anybody, all of these NGO websites. We do think that that's helpful because, again, it helps to document the case, right? Obviously, for the bystander to report it to police, that's going to be more difficult because you probably need the victim involved as part of this to make this actionable, so to speak, right? But yeah, definitely, I think there are these little tools that could be offered along the way that would be very valuable.
John, I hate to cut you off, but I have to jump in right here. Actually,
okay.
If you are a bystander and you're in a position to either record the incident, actually, ideally, record the incident,
Yes.
Serve as that independent witness, you're actually, without ever finding that other person, you can prosecute that entire case, right? You are the witness, not the person who experienced it. If from the video you can prove the elements of the crime, it's actually a much better case than if that person didn't have a video of the incident, went to the precinct and said, hey, this happened to me, and it was X, Y, and Z. So I'd actually just put an asterisk on what John said. Not to say he's wrong, but to say he's wrong, and that you, as the bystander, are in the perfect place to prosecute this individual. Actually, you're in a better place than other people are to do so. So I would highly recommend that you do the recording, that you report it, and you put yourself in the position of who, in that instance, may be someone, as Joann has pointed out, is afraid or fearful of getting involved, or has a language deficiency. You're a lawyer. You know what's going on. You could, first of all, you can stop the incident by showing them that you're recording, and second of all, you can ask them questions like, "Hey, are you doing this because they're Asian?" And you know what? They're going to respond. You watch these videos, they respond every time. But you could literally read them the statute and they would say, yes, as a matter of fact, I am doing this because of my belief regarding his race, creed, or origin. They're going to say it, and you're going to have it on tape. And they're going to be identifiable and potentially arrestable. The second thing I wanted to point out before I give it back to John is that every 911 call is recorded. So if you call 911, I can't speak for 311, but you call 911, get a recording of it, anything that's happening that they can hear on the phone is going to be recorded. So if it takes too long for you to get it out and do a video, or it's like inconvenient for you to do so for whatever reason, you could just dial 911, make a recording of the incident, and say nothing. You don't even have to hold it up. Literally, that's your recording. You dial 911 and put it up. And if it escalates to the point of a crime, when you do report it, say like, hey, I called 911 at this date and this time, and they can pull it up, they can find it, they'll have that recorded.
I will take that friendly amendment any day from you, Joe. Although I will offer a slight amendment of my own, which is when it comes to recording, please make sure that you are physically safe and that you are comfortable doing that, because obviously that is an affirmative act that you are taking. Not to say, I think that's an excellent step, and especially for this lawyer crowd. I'm a past the Papa president, so sort of I know this crowd, and you guys are more assertive, more confident than the typical crowd. So using that tool is excellent.
And I think the other thing I want to mention about the bystander training is that I think Hollerback has some numbers, but that was a training they did nationally. And I think one of the things I point out to Hollerback is that, New York City's been on lockdown for a while, so there aren't that many people riding the subways. So in many ways, the training is not timely at this point. But as we start to plan, getting out and starting to go back to work, I think certainly that will come in. The other work that I want to also mention here is the work that we're doing with some of the groups that have worked with the anti-Semitic attacks that have happened in the city, as well as the Black-led organization that has worked around like community building. Because I think one of the things that I know that John and I share the commitment is that necessarily when these things happen, how do we get in front of it? Today is April 29th. It is the anniversary of the LA attacks in the Korean community that, and so the things that we think about right now, it's how do we start to build community? How do we start to let communities of color start to understand? And how do we build relationships that leads to community resolution? That doesn't necessarily always include law enforcement. Certainly when somebody's pulling a knife on you, right? You do have to call the cops, but are there things that we do because a lot of the low-income communities live together, and this is the reality of New York City. And so how do we start to, the work that the Federation has been doing certainly has never been to say, we want more police in our communities, not to increase police interaction with communities of color, because that perpetuates the assumption that it's just Black people attacking Asian people. And that's wrong too, because, the racist attack, the racist things, that crap I get in my community, they're all white, people saying crazy things to me. So I think, anytime that we can push back on some of this very toxic narrative of who hurts Asian American communities, we certainly need to take those leadership roles. And for the Asian American Federation, we were a little late to the game because we weren't sure if we wanted to do this, but we also have our own reporting site. It's for people who live in New Jersey, Connecticut, and New York, because we have relationships with all three attorneys general in those three states. So we thought if anything happened, we can certainly we can make those connections pretty quickly. And we did it in 8 languages because we said it's, first of all, how we determined those 8 languages. It was, Korean, Chinese, Japanese, because, the East Asian community, certainly the Filipino community, because they're the healthcare workers, right? But also we're hearing stories of the Nepalese community, the the Vietnamese community, anybody who looks East Asian, they're on the receiving end these days. And so we wanted to find that mechanism to be able to have the communities tell us what is happening to them. So we are also, along with John, we were also working with the San Francisco, Professor Zhang in San Francisco, and, Chris Kwok here. We're all going to be working probably, we're going to need to call time at some point and pull those numbers, and we're going to be reporting on what we found. And that one is partly to educate our own community about, that the fact that we do have to speak up, right? Things happen to our community and nothing ever happens for us because nobody ever complains. And so, every time I call and scream at Molinari and shake my fist at him and say, what have you done for my community? People are terrified to go outside. He always reminds me, it's only been 11, he always cites the 11, and 9's been investigated and 2, we don't know, right? So, he's been saying that number to me forever. And it's just, it reminds me that, this is what they're working on. This is the way they put us off at arm's length. So any kind of reports that we do, any times that, the leaders are out there speaking, it's really certainly to make sure that our community understands how important it is for them to speak up, but also to inform the policymakers. People don't think that Asian Americans are subject to, hate crimes and bias attacks. Even before this, we got it all the time. And there were times that, I know that Asian American seniors in certain neighborhoods, heard lots of anti-Asian rhetoric, even before all of this stuff, because random people from different neighborhoods like Forest Hills would call me and say, you don't know me, but I just want to tell you that I saw 2 Asian seniors who don't speak the language walking down, and people were, like somebody was screaming at them, right? Can you do something? So when I reported to the council member to say, did you know some of these things are going on? The council member's response was, not in my district, because that never happens. And so I realized that unless we have numbers to bear out exactly what we've been telling them, nobody's going to ever stand up for us, and nobody's ever going to help us make those policy changes. We have 2 council members out of 51. There's only so much they can do. And so unless we start to demand our rights and demand visibility and recognition, this is where, we really need to be out there. This is civic lesson civic lesson number 1. Unless we get out there and demand things that are rightfully due to us, and to say we are tax-paying, members of this community, and we deserve to have our rights, nobody's gonna come and help us. And so then forever, I'm gonna get the hate crimes commander shoving that 11 number in my face.
Well, one thing that lawyers are good for, in addition to advising clients, is giving voice to people that need help, speaking up. And to that end, I know AABANY is trying to do its part as well to not only get information out there, but also to help collect information and work with a number of your organizations to help put those statistics together and increase the information and data that we have. And of course, focused on New York, AABANY is preparing a community outreach webinar to kind of go through some of the more basic forms of telling people what their rights are, telling them what their options are. We'll have one coming up in a couple weeks. I think the date is May 13th to be the first one in English. And then we're going to follow on with similar webinars for the community in different languages with translated materials. And certainly everyone on this webinar is welcome to help and to volunteer their time. We can certainly use more people to help with this community outreach. AABANY has something called the Community Response Task Force that you can sign up on the website. You're going to get a link as a part of an email after this event. So you can just click the link if you are interested in signing up. You'll just get more information about ways in which you might be able to help. And if there's a call out for volunteers, you'll at least see that. But it's certainly something that AABANY is trying to organize and have as lawyers sort of do our part to help on this issue. And then the remaining minutes of our session here, I wanted to open the floor to anyone that has a question. If you want to undo your mic and speak up, you could also send it through the group chat. We've had a number of questions that helpfully have been answered through the group chat. But if anyone wants to actually speak up, really welcome any questions people have.
Hey Karen, this is Young. Just wanted to let everyone know that I put up the link to the Google form for the CRTF sign up. So we encourage everyone to follow up on what Karen just mentioned. I saw that some law students had piped up and said they would love to volunteer. So I encourage law students to also sign up. I mean, we won't know that you're interested in volunteering unless you let us know that you want to volunteer, and the CRTF form is there to collect information. So we hope that you'll take the time to fill out the form, and then somebody will be in touch with you for sure. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. I see Karen Yao. Did you have a question?
Actually, I want to follow up on what Yang said. I'm Karen. I co-chair the Pro Bono and Community Service Committee. The Community Response Task Force was started several years ago as we were trying to respond to the xenophobia that was fanned by President Trump's campaign and subsequent election. And the task force is looking for any member who is interested not only in working on issues involving fighting anti-Asian violence and bias incidents, but on any issues that are important to the API community, and really would want to be in touch with folks who want to be a part of this effort, to be able to jump in quickly when something that is important to us is happening. So I encourage not only law students, but lawyers who want to be a part of this effort to sign up. And that will include opportunities to give individual assistance to LEP, API community members who need help in documenting and reporting these incidences, as well as on other issues, right? Small businesses, people who are unemployed. So please do take advantage and click on that link Young just sent out.
Anyone have specific questions for our panelists on anti-Asian violence? Hard to see the hands. I see movement.
Hey, this is Thomas Ho. Can I ask a question?
Yes, please.
Have there been, I have a question about the new PPE, the PPP program, Paycheck Protection Program. I heard that it's access to that program, even though it's a multi-billion-dollar, hundreds of billion-dollar program, access is uneven, and it's a lot harder for minority-owned businesses to access those loans, maybe because they don't have relationships with their banks or other more reputable businesses or Caucasian-owned businesses can have access to those loans easier. Have panelists seen that this has been a problem, especially for Asian-owned businesses, Asian or small businesses?
Yes, we do a lot of work with the Asian American small businesses, and we've been serving as the advocacy voice for like small business associations. So for instance, we work with all of the Korean small business associations. And even when the city had their own loan grant program, we were very clear. Small businesses were hurting before COVID, and you can't just constantly make people take out more loans. There's no way for them to pay it back. So let's get some realities. And then even the $5,000 grant program that they had was completely unhelpful because the applications were not even in language, PPP. And then the city, the language access, we were we were one of the organizations that helped to expand language access in New York City. And, we said, when are the two communities that got hit the hardest, Korean and Chinese, when are those, when will the applications in those languages come out? And I will tell you that small business, the entire SBS ghosted us for 3 weeks. Like we would email them, we would stalk them and say, where are the documents? And nobody responded. And finally they said, here it is. And then like a couple of days later, the whole program closed because the money was all gone. Today was that hearing. And so it was interesting to sit in on the council, the virtual hearing that they had. And it was great to hear all the council members demand some numbers, especially Council Member Chin. This is her, Chinatown is her district. PPE, like all of these programs, one of the things I realized, Thomas, and having done a 9/11 project, right, that helped to give out $62 million, right? I know the realities of documentation. And yes, you need to have certain documentations. You need to prove that you're a legit business, blah, 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 right? But the stuff they ask for makes no sense because the reality is there's mom and pop shops, and most of them are immigrants, and most of them are saddled with tremendous fines, various administrative fines, because when you become a small business, they hand you this giant notebook in English and say, here you go, good luck, right? So unless somebody reads it to you and you really understand what all the procedures are and like how to do business in New York, it's impossible. So I know I was on a call with Schumer and Gillibrand today, and they said, I said, when are you ever what's the next stimulus look like? Is it gonna actually help real people versus the Lakers and Ruth Chris Steakhouse? And they said, I think they're gonna try to, make and immigrant small businesses and we even talked about undocumented immigrants. A lot of undocumented families own small businesses, but they can't draw any of the benefits down. And they are the frontline workers. And so, we need to talk about fairness at this point because that's basically who's keeping all of us alive. And so I think there are some guidelines coming, but we do need to push the governor and the mayor to be, to demand numbers. I think we need to, there are public, the council was quiet for a while, but all the hearings are coming up. So that's a great place for accountability. And I think Yang is probably getting all of the signups. I know that, we send out regular updates about what hearings are coming up. So we hope that all of you are paying attention. We need to fight to make sure that the people who are deserving of the help, those are people from our community. During the Great Recession, Asian American small businesses created half the net new jobs in the city. And so when they talk about the economic engine, those are our community members, and they did not get to access anything here. And the big banks pretty much ghosted all the the little guys because they wanted the origination fees. I mean, the list of atrocities is just, getting longer and longer. But, if you would connect with me, I would love to, give you more insight and see if we can possibly work together.
I know the question was about economic assistance and help, but since you raised small businesses, I think small businesses, vandalism, and sort of hate against Asian businesses is also a topic that we didn't touch on as much today. But has anyone seen any trends or data about incidents of vandalism increasing in New York, given how many businesses are owned by Asians?
I think the last call, NYPD said they did see some, not so much vandalism, but also burglary. Like, they go through the roofs and go in there. But I don't think but they didn't release all the numbers. And, they were very, very vague because, again, it's the number 11 that they're working towards. But yeah.
I certainly heard reporting in my own neighborhood that some of the Asian-owned businesses apparently are getting, calls and harassed by, they don't know who, but people calling in, sort of reporting the business as non-essential and they shouldn't be open and kind of doing that. And even the police officers are apologetic about having to call and just, tell them about it. So there's something going on, I think, even if it isn't quite vandalism or burglary.
Absolutely.
Yeah, it's very interesting. Incidentally, both of the New York senators did sign on to the letter that went to President Trump to ask him to do something about anti-Asian violence and hate. That letter is also in the package of materials that were provided with this program. Are there any other final questions for the panelists? I want to give everyone an opportunity. I'll just scroll through.
Hey, Karen, while you're doing that, Karen King.
Yeah.
While you're doing that, just want to give a quick shout out to a lot of the law firm lawyers that are on the line, because as Karen Yao just mentioned in the chat, this CLE is meant to be one of the first of, we hope, many that will instruct and inform lawyers about the COVID-19 issues that are affecting our community and how they can help. So if there are any law firm attorneys on the line whose law firms might want to help us put on some of these presentations, I mean, we really appreciate Simpson Thatcher's help so far in putting these Know Your Rights information into brochures and now on our website. That's been very, very helpful. And we're also very grateful for Paul Weiss, where Karen King is a counsel. So if there are any other law firms that want to step in and help us with either community presentations coming up or some of these informational webinars, we definitely would appreciate it. And I do want to note that come Friday, we're going to start APA Heritage Month, and I can think of no better way to celebrate APA Heritage Month than to give back to a community and to help the community at this time.
Thanks so much, Yang. If there are no further questions, I'd just like to take these final moments to thank our 5 panelists, Jia Lynn Yang, Joann Yu, John Yang, Sheryl Koretz, and Joe Gim. Thank you so much for participating on this panel, and thank you all for attending. We wish you the best. Stay safe, everyone, and have a great day.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Thanks for having me. Take care, everyone.
Thanks.